think about that as we hear about the most egregious examples of how the war on terror manifests itself. But I also want to start by talking about the fact that the war on terror is complex as well. It's not something that's monolithic. It presents itself in so many different ways, in so many different contexts. It's not just, hey, these are terrible Americans doing terrible things, or it's terrible British people doing terrible things in countries abroad. It's so much deeper than that. And when we look at our own Muslim countries, for example, they have been inextricably involved in the war of terror. We're talking about Syria, Morocco, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Algeria, Pakistan, the Emirates, Bangladesh, and many more, willing to torture, to detain, to place on rendition those that are considered suspect, all based on a narrative that was set by the US and its allies. But of course, when we're talking about complexity, we also have to remember that certain situations in countries like Afghanistan, for example, they've been in a state of conflict since before 9/11, since the 70s. And in that period of time, you have various interests perpetuating conflict in these countries. And so, when we're talking today, we do want to talk as much as possible about building complexity into the way that we understand what the war on terror means. Many of us will be very pleased to see the defeat of the US in Afghanistan and them leaving. We've been campaigning and seeking this result for a very, very, very long time. But of course, on the other side of that, understandably, there will be many Hazaras, for example, who will be very concerned about the future that they hold in Afghanistan, considering some of the things that have happened in the past. The war on terror, in Afghanistan, in a way, produces all sorts of complexities that we have to think about. But then when we think about, say, for example, Syria, and we see Hazara militias fighting alongside Bashar al-Assad's forces in Syria, we have another layer of complexity here in terms of the way that the war on terror manifests itself. So when we're talking about the war on terror, often we're not talking about a singular thing. We're talking about many aspects that emerge in many different ways due to geopolitics, due to the way that sectarianism is instrumentalized, due to the way in which diaspora communities live, both in the East and the West. There are so many aspects of this. And so even for example, those people who are interested or happy or are hopeful about the Taliban taking over in Afghanistan, how does that relate to, say, for example, now Afghanistan coming under the orbit of China's influence, potentially? What does that mean for example, for Uyghur Muslims and the sense of solidarity that they may desire or feel in relation to the way in which countries interact with China? There are all these complications that are very, very difficult, I think, for us to think through in singular ways. And so that's why I'm hoping today we're going to hear from a number of different speakers who have various expertise and perspectives, some of which we may not agree with, but hopefully all of which will build on one another in order to help us think through what dialogue might look like going into the future, how we can end cycles of violence. And that's been part of CAGE's core mission since its very inception, that there has to be another way out of this cycle of violence beyond simply locking people up in large numbers, having systems of mass surveillance, having hot wars abroad and cold wars at home. There has to be another way of doing things. And that's what the International Witness Campaign is about. That's why 55 organizations have come together, because at the center of CAGE's identity is this idea of justice and due process, that only by focusing on these things can we really build a stable and just future for everyone, not just our own particular clique or sect or group of friends or ethnicity. And so with that, I want to begin by inviting our first speaker, who's Daryl Lee. Daryl's a wonderful scholar and a very, 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 very close friend of Cage. Daryl's most recently best known for a new book that he's got out called Universal Enemy, which is behind my head somewhere. It's a truly wonderful and scholarly piece of work. Daryl's helped in many situations, in many cases throughout the world, particularly focusing on the war on terror. He has a background in law and anthropology. He speaks multiple languages. He's truly a very brilliant scholar, and we're very fortunate to have him with us today. And so, yeah, I can see Daryl's already with us. So Daryl, I would like you to please take over. Thank you.
Thank you, Austin. And thanks to everyone at Cage and everyone else in the International Witness Campaign for bringing us together today. I also really appreciated the way that you opened up this conversation with the demand for complexity, and also what I think of as the challenge of solidarity, right? I mean, not to plug my own book, but the kind of dilemmas that you're talking about, right? Individuals who are forced to take uncomfortable positions in one place and then therefore taking them in another place. Speaking of, for example, the way Hazaras are positioned in Afghanistan versus Syria, whatever, all of this is a reminder that beyond its appeal as a slogan or as an aspiration, solidarity is often very difficult, challenging, uncomfortable and unpleasant business, right? Because it often entails taking very hard choices in very difficult circumstances. So I appreciate the way that you kind of spotlighted that. So I've been asked to provide historical context on the US reaction to the events of 9/11 in about 10 minutes. I'll do my best. I think the one takeaway that I really must emphasize is that on September 10th, 2011, the United States of America was a settler colonial state grounded in racial slavery and white supremacy, and also a global hegemon with the history of raining untold violence down upon many parts of the world. And on September 12th, 2001, the United States was still a settler colonial state grounded in racial slavery and white supremacy and the global hegemon with a history of raining untold violence down upon various parts of the world. So it's important to attend to these historic changes, but it's also important not to lose sight of the very, very deep continuities in U.S. state practices and patterns of U.S. society that precede 9/11 and also are unfortunately with us to this day. So that being said, what's distinctive about the years before the attacks is that, of course, this was the end of the Cold War. So the United States and its ruling class were enjoying a kind of triumphalism for having defeated the Soviet competitor or Soviet adversary. The gates of sort of neoliberal capitalism were suddenly open upon many parts of the world that they hadn't been previously. But tinged with this triumphalism was also a little bit of a dilemma of victory, right? Without an obvious peer state competitor at that time, and without a single ideology or threat or enemy, the United States and its ruling class was a little bit unsure about how to continue organizing the massive war machine and structure of domination that they had been building up for decades. So the 90s was a slightly interesting moment where the US was sort of trying on different mantles for running the world, right? So there was this idea of ending humanitarian crises in different parts of the world, but that didn't quite catch on with the domestic US population. So it was a bit of it was sort of like a Leviathan slightly adrift, right? Sleepwalking, still dominating the world, but without quite the same level of focus and determination that had been going on during the Cold War. And in this respect, it is interesting to return to Afghanistan as the site of arguably the last major proxy battle of the Cold War, where the United States and Saudi Arabia in particular funded the Mujahideen parties in Afghanistan billions of dollars a year. And of course, once they had achieved their goal, sort of walked away and left the country a complete mess, right? A humanitarian, political, and other disaster, and just setting the stage for the ongoing now half century, I think it's arguable to say, or nearly half century of upheaval and armed violence in that country. And part of what's important about Afghanistan, of course, is something that people were not paying that much attention to at the time, which is that in addition to the Afghan Mujahideen factions fighting the Soviets, there were also Muslim solidarity activists from all over the world who came and who participated as aid workers, involved in education, in da'wah, proselytizing, but also in fighting or jihad. And this sort of gets to the other part of the 90s context, which is, people throw the term jihad around in lots of ways. I want to just focus on jihad as a way of responding to different kinds of political crisis. And there were two major ones I want to focus on in the world in the 90s. The first is kind of a crisis of the nation state. So especially in Algeria and in Egypt in the 1990s, you had these armed insurgencies against governments of predominantly Muslim societies, right? And those were often described or understood by their participants as jihad. The other was a crisis of world order, right? So you have situations in Bosnia, in Kashmir, in Chechnya, where Muslims who traveled to participate, to assist fellow Muslims against other adversaries, right? And this was often understood and portrayed as a response to the failures of the Western-led so-called international community, right? So as the UN was seen to be at best incompetent or at worst complicit in mass atrocities against Muslim populations around the world, jihad formations sort of sprung up as a way of addressing this while bringing, of course, their own baggage and their own problems, which is something that we can talk about at some other point. And then the third tendency was this idea, it's sort of a combination of the two. It's sort of the school of thought that says, well, look, we can't really improve the conditions of Muslim societies as long as they are ruled by authoritarian regimes that have sponsors in the West, right? So this was a school of thought, of course, that is associated with Osama bin Laden, Ayman al-Zawahiri, and the emergence of Al-Qaeda, but it actually predates Al-Qaeda, right? I think the 1993 World Trade Center bombing in New York, and also some of the attacks in France in 1995, undertaken allegedly by Egyptian and Algerian activists, respectively, was kind of an early form of this, right? So insurgencies in Muslim majority societies sometimes have these spillover attacks against the external kind of imperial patron, right, that's backing the regime. So what emerges in the 90s is kind of a shadow war, a shadow counterinsurgency on a global scale, a cat and mouse game, where the United States and its allies begin the campaign of tracking down, hunting down, kidnapping, and sort of disappearing activists who they're going after, especially in places like Croatia, Azerbaijan, Albania. These are some of the early rendition operations that we know about. And then, of course, a sort of deterritorialized group like Al-Qaeda that isn't fighting directly to take over any particular state, but is trying to challenge the United States, wherever they can find manifestations of its power. So this becomes most obvious in the 1998 attacks on the US embassies in Kenya and Tanzania. And the idea of striking embassies in two different countries at once was also intended to manifest a certain kind of power and competence, and the idea that the conflict wasn't going to be limited to any one particular place. And the United States, sort of meets that logic in kind by launching cruise missile attacks on Sudan and Afghanistan simultaneously, right? So the US response is sort of classic escalatory dominance. If you're going to hit us in two countries, we're going to hit you on two continents, at the same time. So, and then of course you have the attack on the USS Cole, the US warship in Yemen in 2000. So these are kind of this was already going on before 9/11, right? This ongoing sort of attempt by the US to hunt down these enemies in various parts of the world. But it's important to mention that at the time, it didn't occupy a massive part of the attention of US society, or even necessarily of US ruling elites. It was sort of seen as one nuisance among many in this period of sort of strategic drift. So I think what is important about the change of the 9/11 attacks is that after trying out different ways of kind of organizing and justifying US global hegemony, the US finally has the answer to the question of what now after the Cold War. And the rest, as they say, is history. But anyway, these are some of the basic points that I want to sort of put on the table and that we should have in the backs of our minds in any discussions about this history.
Thank you so much, Daryl. I think you've done such an amazing job of setting the scene for us for the rest of this conversation, because, leading up to 9/11, that history is just as important as what happens on that day and then what happens after. Like, I think, for those people who birthed this issue 20 years ago, it kind of restructures everything that you know and think about the world. And so I really appreciate you taking us through that journey in order to understand how we get there. So I'll hopefully have some reflections on yours and Spencer's presentations after Spencer's done. So I'm going to introduce Spencer now. We're going to ask him to come up. So Spencer Ackerman is a journalist, writer, and author of a new book called Reign of Terror. Spencer Ackerman is a contributing editor at the Daily Beast from 2017 to 2021. He was senior national security correspondent for the Daily Beast. He is the author of, the forthcoming Reign of Terror, How the 9/11 Era Destabilized America and Produced Trump. He's a former US national security editor for The Guardian. He was also part of the Pulitzer Prize-winning team reporting on Edward Snowden's surveillance revelations. Spencer, thank you so much for being with us today. Please, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much, Asim. I want to thank the International Witness Campaign, CAGE, all of the other organizations supporting this conference. I couldn't have asked for a better lead-in than Daryl. His remarks contextualizing and emphasizing the historical continuities of the war on terror is absolutely crucial, and something that now perhaps I've been saved a little bit of time for. I have been asked to talk about the ways in which the war on terror manifested and led to, politically in the United States, the rise of Donald Trump, which is a preoccupation of my book, which is out now, called Reign of Terror, and the far right generally throughout the Western world. And I think if we keep Daryl's conception of the United States in mind as a settler colonialist nation that enforces a racial caste system in the interests of capital, then we get a very clear picture of how such an entity, once it establishes global hegemony, is going to react to an atrocity like 9/11. And I think we can best see this and best see the politics that will soon become both national and global manifestations of that history in two incidents, one of which is directly after 9/11 and another is a few years before. To take the one before, the worst terrorist attack in American history before 9/11 happens in Oklahoma City shortly in 1995. And its perpetrator is Timothy McVeigh, who is part of a very old terrorist tradition in the United States. Timothy McVeigh is a white supremacist who opposes the United States government because he believes that the United States government is insufficiently committed to enforcing a white supremacist social and economic order inside the United States. And he sees this as license to commit a mass atrocity that kills 168 people and including 19 children. The reason why I bring this up is because through the reaction to Timothy McVeigh, we see the war on terror by virtue of understanding who the war on terror will never be aimed against. McVeigh is part of not just a historical tradition, but a material infrastructure of white political violence. Essentially, what, if you were to map this onto a later discourse in the United States, we would understand as radical American terror, which is never in the mainstream seen as such, and certainly by American institutions treated as such. And accordingly, right after McVeigh's attack, the popular narrative about who was responsible for this atrocity that was broadcast on the major news networks and treated for several days as the explanation for the horror of Oklahoma City was Muslims, that Oklahoma City must have been the next wave in this campaign, supposedly, that, and again, this is a media narrative, that started with the 1993 World Trade Center bombing. Well, very shortly, it becomes clear that Timothy McVeigh, who was in custody at that moment, and takes credit for the attack, puts it in an entirely different context, but not before major media discourse turns to what should be done to the perpetrators of this attack when they are understood to be Muslims. Respectable newspaper columnists like Mike Royko, a liberal hero of the Chicago Tribune, started talking about shooting people on sight, about expelling American Muslims who were here on student or work visas, and all sorts of other premonitions of what will happen, what will be legitimized, what will be justified, what will be viewed as not exceptional after 9/11. And it matters entirely not for these portrayals that it was in fact McVeigh. And when McVeigh, a white American Army veteran, is the perpetrator, there is a narrow investigative focus by federal prosecutors on McVeigh himself, and a very narrow investigative focus on this specific attack. There was nothing like what would happen after 9/11 to criminalize entire communities in the United States, because those communities belong to the overclass, and their terrorism is not seen as terrorism. What do I mean by that? How can we understand this in context? I'm coming to you from Brooklyn, New York. I am a native Brooklynite. I grew up here, and I'm lucky to still live here and raise my family here. Very close to me is a neighborhood called Little Pakistan. The experience of Little Pakistan, some of you may be familiar with, was nothing like the experience of white communities that are left alone after Oklahoma City, and rightfully so, because those communities, like Little Pakistan, had absolutely nothing to do with the attacks of 9/11 or the attacks of Oklahoma City. What happens instead shows the war on terror in reality. What happens is that after 9/11, even though no one from the community is related to the attacks at all, there's not a single Pakistani among the Al-Qaeda hijackers on 9/11, a community of tens of thousands of people starts to get knocks on their doors, cards slipped under their doors with messages from the immigration authorities, from the FBI, and from the NYPD saying, "We need to talk. Contact us at your earliest convenience." This was something that my book frames as exactly what it is not permitted to be understood as by mainstream American discourse, which is a reign of terror, a collective response to an atrocity centering not on the perpetrators of that atrocity, but on many thousands, millions more, not just abroad, but here in the United States. Because once the enemy is defined, not as Al-Qaeda, not as those who perpetuated the atrocities of 9/11, but as something civilizational, as something viewed as functionally indistinguishable from Islam itself, then Americans understood what had happened on 9/11 as something that licenses civilizational vengeance, vengeance that will be inflicted not only abroad, but here at home. And what happens is that there is a different architecture of kidnapping, of indefinite detention, of the manipulation of law, and of criminalization of associations in the United States, criminalization of methods of giving charitable donations that are seen as, on the surface of it, suspicious. A deliberate treatment by law enforcement, including the police here in my own city, of reorienting themselves against the idea of probable cause of criminal behavior or of the commission of an outright crime, but instead as they understood it themselves through the intelligence division of the NYPD and their programs called, employing people that they called rakers, that instead they had to understand entire communities amongst my neighbors in New York City, communities that have nothing to do with acts of violence or acts in perpetration of acts of violence. But instead, the NYPD, like law enforcement broadly around the country, viewed its proper role as cultural repression, as part of a mechanism of collective punishment that didn't distinguish, because it was not interested in distinguishing between violent people and the communities they come from. And again, it's important to go back to how none of this applied to white terrorism, the oldest, most durable, and most American terrorism there is. It is very easy to see in both an environment that will commit such acts and call such acts lawful, define them as acts of law enforcement, define them as valorous acts necessary to avenge 9/11 and prevent another 9/11, that a politics would take root that considers such treatment to be the just order of things in the United States, that will punish and seek to challenge a politics of solidarity, that will seek to prevent a politics of solidarity from taking hold, while simultaneously leaving this other infrastructure of political violence, this time by white people, in the name of preserving something deeply essential about America intact, and allow it to gather strength outside of a surveillance gaze that as a
Sorry, everybody. I think it seems Spencer has frozen. Maybe there's a problem with his internet connection. We'll see if we can get him back on. Yeah, in the meantime, do check out Spencer's book, which my colleague Asfar has posted in the chat function. Okay, I think we'll see if we can get Spencer back. But in the meantime, what I'll do is maybe just share a couple of things that I was thinking about while both Daryl and Spencer were speaking. They both, it's interesting that in a way that they're both talking about these kind of cultures really of solidarity that have existed for various people for various reasons at various times. And I remember well, after 9/11, on the first anniversary, I was working as an usher in a court. I had kind of various responsibilities in the court as I was working. And one day my line manager came to me and said, just to let you know that we're going to be holding a kind of a minute silence for the victims of 9/11. So, it'd be great if you could also attend. We're all gathering together. We'll put up some notices. And I remember saying to him at the time, why he felt that particular atrocity. And I said, I acknowledge the fact that it was a great tragedy. Why it felt so particularly important to him as somebody who lives in London, and, of course, is separated by the entirety of the Atlantic. when, say, for example, there were other anniversaries in that same period of time that I was working there over the summer that could have been commemorated as well, such as, for example, the Rwandan genocide, even though, of course, it was much earlier than 9/11. And initially, he was quite kind of shocked and bemused by my line of questioning. And I said, look, there's no harm in, of course, commemorating anybody's loss. I think it's all important, it's all vital. But I said it does seem a bit strange that you've asked me and you yourselves are thinking about commemorating this one incident, almost as if there is something about the value of these lives that seem particularly important to you as opposed to any other life anywhere else in the world. And that was, kind of very, very, very telling for me in a kind of very early period. This was before I had even kind of embarked on a pathway towards kind of studying these issues or being involved in activism. But even as somebody who was, relatively speaking, less political than I am at that time, I felt, kind of taken aback by this particular moment. And actually, in some ways, this was this kind of attitude was confirmed for me later when Mazen Beg came home from Guantanamo Bay. I'll stop my anecdote there because we have Spencer back, and I would like to give him the chance to finish his words. So I'll continue in a bit. Please, Spencer, nice to have you back with us.
I am so sorry to everyone at this conference who have worked so hard. My Wi-Fi, unfortunately, kind of can't be helped. I will just try as quick as I can just to wrap up by saying that a politics that would allow such treatment to take root, again, speaking back to Daryl's point, has a very deeply rooted history to it. And accordingly, will very soon produce politicians like Trump, very soon will produce politicians that go looking for civilizational explanations to rationalize all of this violence, not only because of the initial need to, as they see it, avenge 9/11, but because of what happens overseas in the intervening years, which is that the United States' wars become disasters. When exposed, they are understood as efforts at inflicting tremendous brutality with extremely little strategy and accordingly very little to show from it, yielding nothing durable except human suffering. Remember back to what Daryl said about the United States as a settler colonialist nation. In such a nation, in such a place where before we separate out into our particular individual politics, we understand America as exceptional, as virtuous, as good and just, and accordingly to be judged by its character as opposed to being judged by its actions. Then what happens is that you get impulses within mainstream politics to understand the disasters of these wars in hysterical ways as an enemy that has already been described as functionally subhuman, has somehow so challenged, so frustrated the United States that it can only take action at home against vulnerable populations using very familiar tools, mass incarceration, immigration repression, and so forth. And this is how you get a politics that views refugees America is materially responsible in direct ways for creating, treated in mainstream politics as indistinguishable from ISIS. And we are seeing that happen again in two different ways as related to the supposed end of the Afghanistan war. First, those Afghans who the United States, in fact, was able to extract and was interested in extracting, Afghans who had aided the US or its allies or Western organizations throughout the war that were able to get out. Those who worked for America, treated by powerful politicians, primarily but not exclusively on the right, as being indistinguishable from the Taliban. And then as well, a broader issue, by no means limited to the right, and on display by the Biden administration, as treating the war itself and its failure as being the responsibility of the Afghans and not of the Americans, that a culture of corruption was, in the mainstream telling, unaffected by America's war effort, not that America's war effort made all of these extant problems in Afghanistan worse. And that, I think, is a way in which, once we understand the interplay of those very deep historical currents in American history, we can understand the war on terror not only in its operational impact, but in its political culture. And once we do that, we can understand how an entity, how a movement like Donald Trump's is inevitable. And we can also understand how through solidarity, it can be confronted and stopped. Thank you so much, and I apologize for my technical difficulties.
Thank you so much, Spencer. We really appreciate your time, and no worries at all. You know, these things happen. We live in this kind of online age at the moment. Yeah, so, you know, again, thank you to Daryl and Spencer for their really thoughtful words. I think, you know, again, both building on one another in important ways as we think about how, you know, we've come to this moment that we're in. And I'm going to just cut my remarks about their pieces short, just to say that, you know, it's really interesting for me that, you know, as you know, Muslim communities in particular, suspect communities, where we're patently aware of the divisions that we have with one another and the kind of difficulties that that separate us, the different lines that exist. But nothing constructs the ummah as a specific phenomenon as much as surveillance does. And it's quite a remarkable thing that actually in those moments, it's a kind of a white supremacist infrastructure that kind of rids all of those divides, because they don't care if you're Sunni or Shia, or if you're from Iran or Pakistan or Afghanistan or Somalia or Yemen or wherever you're from. When you're going through a border crossing, that suspicion is always there. And so it's important that we understand where that comes from, where that tendency to flatten all of us and see us all as a communal threat, where it comes from. And I think both Daryl and Spence have done an excellent job of helping to understand how we've come to that moment. But of course, you know, it's important that we have historians and anthropologists who can help document how we've come here through their scholarly work and their kind of journalistic investigations. But we also have people who have been directly affected by the global war on terror, and people who have not only survived it, but also are, you know, kind of on the front lines of combating it and resisting it. And it's my great honor to host a discussion in this next section between, you know, two people who, you know, I consider very dear to myself and also to the whole family at CAGE. The first is Amina Masood Janjua, the Chairperson of Defense of Human Rights of Pakistan, and also our sister Lina Al-Arian from the Coalition for Civil Freedoms, just to give you a background to both of them. So Amina Baji, she's an activist known for her work against enforced disappearances in Pakistan. She is the chairperson of the rights group Defense of Human Rights Pakistan. Her career in activism started when her husband, Masood Ahmed Janjua, disappeared on 30th July 2005, and to this date is still missing. Apart from enforced disappearances, her work includes providing legal support to prisoners in foreign countries, arranging financial support to the families of victims of enforced disappearance, and eradication of torture, from jails and detention centers. Lina Al-Arian is a Palestinian-American mother and activist living in Boston, Massachusetts. I think that's Massachusetts. She is the co-director of the Coalition for Civil Freedoms, an organization co-founded by her father, Samuel Arian, a former political prisoner in the US, who was deported in 2015. Lina has worked at a number of human rights and justice nonprofits, including American Muslims for Palestine, United Voices, and the Middle East Children's Alliance. She holds a master's degree in Middle Eastern Studies from the University of Chicago. She is a contributor to the volume Being Palestinian, Personal Reflections on Palestinian Identity in the Diaspora, which is going to be published, which was published by Edinburgh University Press in 2016. So welcome and thank you both. Assalamu alaikum. It's really wonderful to have you with us.
Thank you so much.
I really wanted to start by asking you both to just give us a brief background to, the cases that are so fundamental to your lives. Maybe if we can start with Amna Baji and then Lina, if you could then follow, please.
Yeah, thank you so much, Asim. And of course, when this happened, there was an incident in my life, and that was on 30th July 2005, that my husband, Masood Ahmed Janjua, who was a businessman and educator, he was going to Peshawar along with his friend Faisal. And while going there, we lost contact with them. And to date, we have no information as to their whereabouts. So we tried everything in our in the level best capacity, whatever we can do. But there was no news about them. And finally, after suffering here and there, after really, that was like a hell fallen on me, because I had 3 children and they were just left to be on themselves and be depressed by the absence of their father. So Masood was actually very close to his family and to his aging parents. All of a sudden, when this happened, we were like in a kind of turmoil, in an emotional setback, which was unable to cope up with. So gradually we started to look for him here and there. And then there was, after 1 year, there was a suo motu notice taken for Masood Janjua in the Supreme Court of Pakistan. So that was a way forward for us, that something is now going to happen. But unfortunately, when the case started in the Supreme Court, there was a witness, Dr. Imran Munir, who saw my husband in illegal detention of Pakistan. When he was about to give his testimony, so there started a movement in Pakistan in which President Pervez Musharraf actually he imposed a semi-martial law or an emergency situation in the country, because of which that Imran Munir could not give his testimony. And all the courts were like, they were redundant, they could not work. All the judges were house arrested and they could not work. So there was a judicial crisis in the country for 2 years. And for 2 years, we were just hand in glove with the lawyers, and we were struggling and with the momentum of the lawyers movement. And we were holding rallies for the release of the judges. In a country like Pakistan, when you don't have any judicial system, how can you expect to get justice for your loved one? So those were the days of the post 9/11 era. And when we all knew that Pervez Musharraf was the one who partnered with Bush regime. When George Bush called him after 9/11, and he told Pervez Musharraf that either you are with us or against us. And if you are not going to be an ally with us, then we are going to send you to Stone Age. These were the kind of words he used. And also he said that it's a crusade. So, this is the connection with the war and terror, and with this kind of enforced disappearances which started happening. So my husband, I could not even imagine that this war and terror is going to hurt me or my household or my husband will be taken away. But it happened. And to date, I have no clue as to what happened to him. His case was highly fought in the Supreme Court for 14 years, up to 2018, the case was in the Supreme Court. But when I was away, I was gone to Germany for a UDHR conference. Then in my absence, the case was fixed. And within 5 minutes, Masood's case was shifted, was disposed of, and it was transferred into the Commission of Inquiry. The Commission of Inquiry is holding the hearings of these cases for the last 10 years. And that's a very, very failed apparatus of delivering justice to the cases of the disappeared. So unfortunately, now my husband's case lies nowhere and it is being fought on the streets of Pakistan. So this is very, very unfortunate the way things move. And he's not alone. During the struggle, I came to know that there are thousands of others, there are hundreds of others who are in search of their loved ones, just like I am. So from the very beginning, this was my desire and my wish that I should work and I should help others who are in the similar situation, because I knew the depth of the grief and the torture and turmoil and the stigma which your whole family is feeling. We are being separated from the society. We are being stigmatized because of this having a loved one who is disappeared. So people usually get a lot of disturbance in their families, in their households. But I was lucky to have my father-in-law and mother-in-law, and also my own parents who were taking care of my children. Because I was mostly on the streets. I was organizing protest demonstrations. I was organizing meeting the press, and I was arranging rallies and press conferences. So nobody was with my children. That was, my parents were really angry with me, to tell you the truth. And they were telling me that, why are you leaving your children? You are a single parent. If something happened to you, then what will happen to your children? So that was the moment when I gave them this answer that, yeah, I am leaving my children because I trust Allah, and I leave them for Allah to train them to tarbiyat, for talim and tarbiyat from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And inshallah, they will be much better than all the children in the world, because I'm leaving them for the sake of all the aggrieved people, to trying to bring peace in their lives and trying to bring justice into their lives. So
Thank you so much for sharing that. I know, I've been to Pakistan many times, and I've had the great fortune of visiting you and your family in your home, and eating with you and attending conferences with you. And I know the immense burden it placed on you all. So thank you for everything that you've done over these years. And inshallah, we're going to continue talking. But if I could bring in Lena, obviously Amna Baji was the wife of somebody who was detained, but you were a daughter, and you were very young when your father's situation started. Can you please tell us a bit about that, please? Thank you.
Sure. First, I want to thank you, Asim. I want to thank Cage and the International Witness Campaign. As a representative of CCF, I'm very honored to join you and to partner with you in this important initiative. My heart goes out to you, Sister Amna. Hearing your story is like so many of the families that I work with, talking about the stigmatization, the way it completely shatters your life, the effects that it has on children. This pain never leaves you. I'm here now, decades later. I'm a survivor. I've been out the other side of it, and the pain never goes away. So my story begins well before 9/11. It was helpful to have Spencer talk about the Oklahoma City bombing, in the way that the media tried to pin it on Muslims, the targeting of the Muslim community after that, because one of those individuals was my father, who was targeted by the media, specifically Stephen Emerson and his lackey at the local newspaper, who spent a decade in a very vicious smear campaign that he led against my father in that newspaper that published thousands of articles against him. I was maybe in third or fourth grade at the time, where the front page of the newspaper at the time, the the headline was "Splash Ties to Terrorists," and there's my father at the cover of it without any proof, without any, provable allegation. I always tell people that I was under surveillance from the moment I was old enough to use a telephone. Unfortunately, after my father's arrest, we were given boxes and boxes of CDs. I heard myself as a child speaking to my friends. They didn't discriminate against who it was in our household that they recorded. It wasn't as though he was just targeted. From the moment that we would pick up the receiver, we were a house of 5 children. If the landline receiver came off the hook, it would be recording the entire time, everything that was going on in our house. At some point, we suspected that there were bugs even planted in the house, and that turned out to be true. Of course, the government came out and tried to deny it later, but we found them. We saw them with our eyes. My parents did. I remember we had a bat in our backyard. My father's office was an extension of the house. We would hear people all the time coming in and out. They would set off our alarms. At some point, when my mother was watching us, my father was traveling, a police officer came at the door at 8 o'clock in the morning, and he said, "Mrs. Alarian, your neighbor is complaining because you're putting your trash all the way in his garbage can." And this was like down, 2 blocks away. And she said, my son gives me a hard time taking our trash from the, garage to the end of the driveway. We're not putting our trash in other people's bins. And of course, years later, when we're going through discovery, there's an entire category called trash, of everything they were doing. So this is to say that as this was happening, the FBI, of course, raided our home. I remember coming to the house after a long day. My uncle picked us up because he didn't want us to see our house was turned upside down. I was 10 years old at the time. Years later, the same thing would happen when I was 17, when my father was arrested. Of course, they don't discriminate. They barge on, at our door, knocking in the early hours of the morning. That's the way they like to do it. They took my college computer. They took everything that belongs to us. And of course, in 1997, my uncle was targeted and arrested and held under secret evidence. And that's really what made my father an even bigger target when he started campaigning for the civil rights of Muslims at the time. There are about 24 Muslims, Arabs and Muslims, who were held under secret evidence at that time. And my father led a national campaign to end the use of secret evidence. So at least they were able to succeed in preventing new cases, excuse me, until they were finally able to get those people out of prison. Now, after 9/11, unfortunately, CCF advocates for about 250 currently incarcerated political prisoners. And yet these cases still manifest every day. And, I'm here, and the work that I do is to just remind people that this continues to happen, and that unlike the campaigns that, the Muslim community led in the civil rights and human rights communities led in the 90s, there hasn't been any strong pushback to actually end these atrocious policies that criminalize us and really just vilify members of the community. I mean, when people say the war on terror is a war on Islam, I wholeheartedly agree with that. I went on a lot of different directions. This is a big story. I mean, there's so many things I'm leaving out, so many more that I could say, but in the interest of time, I kind of gave you different parts of it to understand where I fit into it.
No, thank you. Thank you, Lena. Obviously we've done an event with your father before, and people can find that on some of our channels, inshallah. I think it is an extremely important case, but I think it's so instructive as well because your father was an activist before his own case started. He was somebody who was trying to defend the rights of others. In that case, it was it was his brother-in-law who was impacted, and many other people alongside his brother-in-law too. But kind of, I think defending the rights of others has been the DNA of your family. And I guess I really wanted to get more of a sense of the trajectory that you went through going from somebody who was living in this house that I was under constant surveillance to being, one of the directors of an extremely important kind of civil rights organization in the US that is defending the rights of others. I think it's important, it's instructive, especially for our younger audience who maybe feel the pressure of living in an environment like we have CVE now and Prevent, and they feel under this pressure all the time. Maybe they can learn something from the experiences that you had.
Yeah, thank you. Silence isn't an option. It was never an option in my household. I mean, that's what my parents taught me. And I always say that, as a vocal and outspoken and activist as my dad was, a lot of the courage that I have comes from my mom, because she was the person on the outside who led the campaign, both for her brother and for her husband. And she always just inspired me to continue to fight and not to worry about what the people who are trying to vilify and criminalize us think. I think a lot of it is just we went into survival mode. A lot of our families, we see two responses. There's obviously fight or flight, and a lot of them, are fighters, and they continue to impress me and inspire me every day. Sister Amna spoke about the stigmatization earlier on the panel you hosted on Guantanamo, and the people who are incarcerated, their families are treated as suspect and guilty as well. They're alienated from their communities. And that's unfortunately the experience that my family had. The mosque and the school and the community and everybody there that he had founded, they stopped calling our home. My father, our house was open day and night for people. He would counsel them over everything. But after his arrest, it was the silence was deafening. So he already kind of established the foundations of how to create a campaign from advocating for my uncle's case and the others. He started a local group called the Tampa Bay Coalition for Justice and Peace. As you can see, my father always loved to work in coalitions. There's the strength in numbers, and we've since followed that model. And after his arrest, my siblings and I sort of picked up the mantle, and we were writing the press releases for him. And we would go to these conferences, and people, would say, well, we don't know what we can do, but it seems like you have a great group down there helping you guys. We get these emails from the Tampa Bay Coalition, not knowing that it's his kids who are out there into the courtroom and writing press releases. But eventually the people, members of the non-Muslim community came around, and they really led the fight. My colleague at CCF, Dr. Melva Underbaki, she worked at the university where my father taught, and she came forward, as did members of her church who were out there every day in front of the courthouse. And then eventually, when my father was released under house arrest in Virginia, he started to learn about other cases that were proliferating around the country. Obviously, his was the big, terrorism, first major terrorism case post 9/11 that the FBI and the government were really, they thought it was a slam dunk. They thought for sure they're going to get these 4 Palestinian men. But thankfully, that case ended in no guilty verdicts. And, when they tried to get him again, he brought together a lot of members of different organizations and communities that were organizing separately under the umbrella of a coalition that would tackle head-on the post 9/11 abuses and targeting and criminalization of Muslim Americans. And so the term that we've used to describe it, based on how the government called it, is preemptive prosecution. And they said, oh, well, we're going to get them preemptively, but it's like, on what? And CCF has since put out 2 reports, Inventing Terrorists, the Lawfare of Preemptive Prosecution. We have a database that tracks all of these national security cases, and we argue that 94% of them are built on preemptive prosecution as a law enforcement strategy. And we do a lot of programs for families and just try to empower them, since they're already their primary advocates for their incarcerated loved ones. And we try to equip them with the tools to, lead campaigns for the freedom of their loved ones. And for many of them, they've exhausted all legal recourse. So unless we roll back the, completely unchecked, out of control powers of the FBI. We get rid of these horrible material support laws. Unfortunately, very little can be done otherwise to help their loved ones. This is just a little bit of what drives me is the mission and the experience. But I have to say a lot of it is also survivor's guilt, if I'm being honest. We were one of the very lucky ones. My father is deported. He's thousands of miles away. I see him a couple of days a year or a couple of weeks a year. And yet I feel acutely that I've, been spared in a way that many others have not, including the daughters and the family members of the Holy Land Five, the family of Dr. Afia Siddiqui, and many, many others. And, Sister Amna, who I pray also for justice in her case.
I mean, Ya Rab, yeah, no, absolutely. There are just so many cases, and it's always so strange to hear survivors speak about how fortunate they are when you've all been through so much. And I think it's very, very difficult for us to quantify really, the extent of the harm that was caused and what you all went through. Obviously, Amina Baji, in your case, your situation continues, and it's one of the remarkable things I think about your legacy that you've given us. I've publicly said on many occasions that you're one of my heroes. I see you as somebody who gives so much. There's one image that really it's remained with me for so many years, ever since it happened. It was a front page image of Pakistani newspapers of your son being surrounded by police officers with sticks, beating him as he was kind of doing what any good son should do, really, which is calling not only for his father's rights and his father to be returned safe and sound, or at least at the very minimum be charged with a crime, because your call was always so much more simple than kind of release him. It was always just allow justice to be done, and you've been so consistent on that all these years. And yeah, I guess I wanted to learn more from you, and for our viewers to learn more about what it takes to build an organization like Defense for Human Rights, to do this work, to represent thousands of families who have been disappeared. And we are talking about thousands here when we talk about the context of enforced disappearances in Pakistan. So could you just tell us a little bit more about that journey, please?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Thank you so much. And before that, I extend my solidarity to Sister Lena, because that was a very, very moving story. And we women always stand together in the hour of need and in the hour of trial. So about my becoming chairperson of Defense of Human Rights, it was like in the beginning when my husband disappeared and I was in acute anguish and in emotional torture, I would say. So which was not diminishing by anything at all. So at that moment, when I saw in the Supreme Court corridors, there were people like myself. There were mothers, fathers, and then their loved one, their son was disappeared. So, and there were wives whose husbands were disappeared, very young wives with small children. So automatically it comes to my mind, and it's Alhamdulillah, it's Allah's subhanahu wa ta'ala's tawfiq, which was given to me to stand up for all of them. And from that moment, I immediately started writing applications for all those who came across me in the Supreme Court or during the press conference or in the protest demonstrations. So initially there were 16 families whose cases were admitted by the Supreme Court. And I would give credit to the Supreme Court as well, because they really cared and they for the fundamental rights of the citizens. And they allowed these kind of cases to be heard in the Supreme Court. And that was unprecedented. That was happening for the very first time in the entire history of Pakistan. So that was the beginning in 2005 and 6. And then gradually in 2007, when we tried to go towards the GHQ, when our numbers were exceeding 100. So right at that moment, we decided to march towards the general headquarters of army and simply ask them one simple question, that the Eid is coming near. So can you grant us back our loved ones? So that was a simple question we wanted to ask them. And we have also written down that letter. That was the moment that we first time in my movement, we faced a crackdown, and there was baton charge, and there was tear gas, and we were just we were surrounded by so many police and in so many different kinds of uniforms that was unbelievable. So our children were taken away from us, and all the women were forced to ride a bus, and they were abandoned to somewhere unidentified locations. And our children were beaten in front of our eyes. So that was one moment which was very, very difficult for me as a mother, because my children were beaten, and Muhammad was the one, the picture you are telling me about, that was on the front page of every newspaper in Pakistan. So he was taken to a police station, and then my father-in-law, also a colonel, retired. He went to the police station and really gave a hard talk to the policeman, that why are you taking my grandchild just because he's asking for answers for his father who's disappeared? And this is the way you do to the children of the nation? And then he brought him back, and then we were united. And literally my daughter Aisha, she was 8 at that time, and she fainted because she was pleading to the all the people surrounding us, and definitely not only police, but there were many people from intelligence agencies who were there. So she fainted, and she was pleading to them, please, you have taken my father, don't take my brothers away. So that was the sentiment in the very beginning of this cause. And even I didn't know that it's going to grow that much, that Masood will not come, and I'll go on arranging campaigns, arranging meetings, arranging conferences, and even traveling across Pakistan to meet people and victims from other provinces. Because we are in the center, we are in Islamabad, but we do travel to Karachi, which is the province of Sindh, and to Balochistan, and also to Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, which is the northern province, and center is of course Punjab. So we were also traveling, and then we were uniting and having catharsis as well, because people and families, I found, they were in depression, in severe depression, and they had given up hope. They didn't wanted to do anything, and they had simply they were simply sitting at home. So then I tried to elevate them and giving them hope, counseling them. Although I didn't know that what was the proper method of doing a psychosocial counseling, but gradually I learned from different psychologists, and we have engaged now psychologists to give psychosocial counseling to the families of the disappeared in Pakistan. And this we started about 2 years ago. And also we are now, because I was not a lawyer, but I was appearing in front of the Supreme Court from the very beginning for Masood's case and for 16 others. And then the list grew from 16 to 40, and from 40 to 749, which I believe is the largest number any lawyer can fight in the Supreme Court. Although I was not a lawyer at all, but I was allowed to plead for the cases of the disappeared in this highest platform. So my children were also around me all the time, and they were also becoming more and more mature every day, because they also felt it very strongly about their father's absence and my struggle, that how our mother is struggling so hard and our father is still not with us. So this was a heavy burden on my children. So they were always around me, always supporting me, always, when I would say anything, that whether I should stay home or go, they would always say, no, you can go. So that was why I went to Amnesty's tour, which was arranged in 2008, where I was to visit the parliament members and human rights parliamentarians and senators of almost half of Europe. So I went to Norway, Sweden, Switzerland, UK, Germany, and I also had to go to America to meet the staff of John McCain. Sorry, McCain, and the other one was Biden and Obama. So I had to meet, and that was a time when elections were very near. At that moment, when I was about to go to New York from Switzerland, at that moment, my visa were revoked. And because during those meetings in Europe, I was all the time talking about disappearances and how it has affected Pakistani people, and it was related to the war on terror. So I was defining the whole story and how it started and why it started. So that was the reason, because there were people who were staff from America as well, from the US as well, and they were listening to me. So that was why it was conveyed beforehand, and I was not allowed to go to America. Although there were a lot of people who were ready to welcome me, there was a delegation coming to the airport to give me surprise and everything, and all the meetings were fixed. So that was how our first visit to Europe and came to an end. And then later on, like Cage, I was associated with Cage in the beginning. Then with Amnesty International, we had a lot of conferences together and many events. And then towards the 2014, when I was very, very heartbroken because of the incident which happened in Pakistan. Everybody's aware of that. Army public school children were shot, and they were like killed brutally, and they were like around 80 children who were killed, more than 80 children who were killed, and the school teachers and staff and librarian and everyone. So that was a turning point for my cause, because in the beginning, everybody was coming to our camps, and all the head of the states were showing solidarity. But that was a moment in when there were many laws which were imposed, and according to that law, the disappearances were kind of given a legal cover. It was Action in Aid to Civil Power Regulation, and there was Pakistan Protection Ordinance. In the same way, which you are also observing, same kind of like laws which are being imposed in UK and also in America, the Patriot Act, and also like you have in UK Prevent. So these kinds were imposed, and that was giving like a clean chit to the perpetrators of the enforced disappearances, that they are doing the right thing. Actually, they were portraying that they are capturing the terrorists, and all the disappeared are actually the terrorists. So that was the formula, that was the perception which was given in those days. So that was the most difficult time of the whole struggle, because I was given threats, and I was given some CDs were dropped in my office, and letters were dropped at my home, and also face to face I was given this this bashing that your cause is finished and you are no longer are going to go on with your cause and disappearances and your mobilizations. So there are laws to cater for that. So your cause is finished. So I just told those individuals that my cause is not finished and I'm aggrieved. So if you are so much willing to eliminate me, then give me back my husband. So, but they had no answer to that. And they said, I was also telling them about that they had given me a severe bashing in 2014, when almost 700 families of the disappeared were in mobilization in the D Chowk, Islamabad, where we are also having it today. So at that moment, they again, there was a crackdown in the same way we had it in 2008 and 2007. So, and I was beaten. I was the one who was beaten, and my other fellow women folk, and especially the very old ladies, were punched on their chests. So that was very, very sad during the times of Mia Nawaz Sharif. And although he used to come to our camps and he used to cry with us. and say that when my government will come and I'm going to put an end to this violation. But similarly, the same way Myanmar Sharif said, then Mr. Imran Khan said the same things, that I promise you that in my tenure, during my reign, there will be no disappearances at all. But what actually happened was otherwise. Disappearances are still going on and on and on. Although if you see that what was the cause of disappearances was the war on terror. The war on terror is finished. Then why the people are still being disappeared? Because in Pakistan, it has become a culture. It has become so deeply embedded in society, in the power corridors. Even the political opponents are using it. The agencies are using it to curb any kind of dissent, any kind of freedom of expression, any kind of any critique. Nobody is now, the government especially, is allowing any kind of dissenting voices, any kind of freedom of expression is curbed by this strong iron hand of enforced disappearances. So unfortunately, people like human rights activists, human rights defenders, social media activists, lawyers of the disappeared, and even those family members of the disappeared who are pursuing the cases of their disappeared loved ones are also being disappeared. So this is like something very rampant and ongoing. And that was why we had in 2014, when I was very depressed and very low, we got affiliated with AFWAD, and that was another, I would say, a breath of fresh air, because they were very nice people from Asia Pacific and Asia, in this region, from Bangladesh, from India and Kashmir, and also Thailand, Indonesia. So they were all a group of 16 countries. They were all focused on fighting against enforced disappearances. So that was how I came to know a lot of leaders of human rights, like Khurram Parvez, like Mary Eileen Bakalso, and also Adila, who's the one of the mothers of the Plaza de Mayo. You must be aware of the Argentinian mothers who gather around a square and they just circle silently, and they are just holding the pictures of their loved ones. So it was lovely to meet those icons of struggle. So they were so brave, so daring, and they were doing so much for the disappeared people. That really opened my eyes into, like, I'm not alone. I'm not doing it. I'm not doing something which is very strange or alien. There are people who are like me and who are struggling in their own societies, in their own countries. So I really felt that I belong with them. And we human rights defenders are just like one family, one community. And after coming back from Philippines, I was very happy, and I started reorganizing my defense of human rights upon a very, very, I would say, extensive scale. And AFAD also helped us in capacity building and research, and in many things, in conferences, also opened our minds and hearts even more. And that was gradually, we started submitting cases to the working group of the enforced disappearances. And then I visited Geneva many times to be part of the working group, hearings of the working group, and also to be part of the UPR session, which is the Universal Periodic Review against any country. So Pakistan's UPR was in 2017. And in the same year, I visited Geneva to be occupied in the pre-UPR ceremonies, in which we are supposed to meet the missions who are there, permanent missions of different countries, and convince them through our talk and our presentation that you should give recommendations to Pakistan regarding enforced disappearances. So like this, people can, and human rights defenders usually recommend for many other human rights violations. But I had a mission to meet different missions, and I met almost 20 missions. I convinced them for doing recommendations, and Alhamdulillah, 17 countries voted and gave specific recommendations for Pakistan to handle their enforced disappearances. And that was a very big pressure again on our government. So that was how I succeeded a little bit, but there's a lot to be done. Shiri Mazari, our human rights minister, is now floating a bill against enforced disappearances, which has more of a a few very good clauses, like it will be enforced disappearance will be punishable, and it will be treated as a separate crime and punishable by 10 years of punishment, 10 years of prison. But on the same hand, it says something very nasty, that all those people who are claiming that our loved ones are disappeared, and they are disappeared at the hand of the secret agencies, and if we are not able to prove it, then there'll be we can also get punishment of 5 years. So that is something very, very astonishing, and it's like something that they don't want to give us an absolute beautiful law which will be helpful in our fight. Rather, it's something to help the perpetrators of this enforced disappearance. So that is very, very unfortunate.
Well, please do keep us informed in terms of the developments on that bill. It sounds like it's probably unhelpful rather than being of any assistance whatsoever. It seems like a cover for the security agencies, unfortunately. And, if we're going to stand together, as you've mentioned, then it's important that we probably highlight the egregious nature of this piece of legislation. I want to thank you both. I'm really sorry I could actually listen to both of you for so much longer, but because we have other guests, we have to bring them in. But I just want to say it takes you both, I think, give us so much courage to carry on doing our work, because you've displayed through your actions, through your solidarity with others, how despite the many difficulties you've been through, that it is possible to resist. It is possible to show solidarity to others and help. So thank you again. And now I'm going to invite up our next speaker, Aaron Hughes, who's an artist and an Iraq war veteran. So Aaron Hughes is an artist, curator, organizer, teacher, anti-war activist, and Iraq war veteran, working through an interdisciplinary practice rooted in drawing and printmaking. He works collaboratively to create meaning out of trauma, transform systems of oppression, and seek liberation. Aaron's work with a range of art and activist groups include About Face, Veterans Against the War, Just Seeds Artist Cooperative, Emerging Veteran Art Movement, Prison and Neighborhood Arts or Education Project, and the Tea Project. Aaron, thank you so much for joining us. I really look forward to you sharing some words. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you, Mozam and Cage, for inviting me. I'm really honored to be here. I was invited here to reflect on serving in the global war on terror as a veteran. I just wanted to start by acknowledging, like most veterans, I did not have any kind of exceptional, or I do not have any kind of exceptional military history. I was simply a truck driver and a sergeant in the Illinois Army National Guard. I was a very small cog in a vast machine. But even from my small, limited perspective, I could see how fraught, unjust, and dehumanizing the whole system was. With that in mind, I just want to begin by saying, as a veteran of the global war on terror, as a member of About Face Veterans Against the War, and as an American, a part of what I'm here to do is to take responsibility and take a position of solidarity with those most impacted by the global war on terror, which are not veterans. I acknowledge and apologize and am sorry for my role in the occupation of Iraq, the destabilization and destruction of that country. I am saying that not for forgiveness, but to take responsibility, something I believe America needs to do and commit. And I believe it needs to commit to paying reparations for all those people unjustly impacted by the global war on terror. I believe it is important that Americans campaign across America against sanctions and demand reparations. From Cuba to Iran, sanctions have devastated the poorest and most vulnerable people, sometimes lethally, while those in power seldom miss a meal. This brings me to the crucial point of, I think, maybe while I'm here, what I know from my deployment and the core of who I am is that people are not a means to an end. I do not believe in dehumanizing and devaluing the life of anyone to reach some political, social, economic means. I know that while dehumanizing individuals and even those you or I might believe are enemies, that one dehumanizes themselves. That's something that became very clear to me during my deployment. And I know that the global war on terror is based on this kind of dehumanization, racism, and Islamophobia. This dehumanization, racism, and Islamophobia is rooted in the ideas of American exceptionalism and the myth of safety and militarism. Unfortunately, growing up in the Midwest, I believed in American exceptionalism and the myth of safety in militarism. That belief, along with my longing to get out of my mom's home, to be financially dependent, to go to college, brought me to the Illinois Army National Guard. These kind of economic reasons are why many people in the US join the military. It's a social ladder. It's one of the few social systems that allow people to advance in our society. When Sergeant Love picked me up, my Army recruiter, we talked about sandbagging the Mississippi River. And at that time, the Cold War had just ended. It was 2000, and there was conversations and ideas about a peace dividend. I could not have imagined the global war on terror. I just thought about my family, who was from Louisiana, and the multiple hurricanes they had been through, and the idea of showing up when people were in need. And that's what I thought I'd be doing in the military. 1 month, after I finished basic training, September 11th happened. And in January of 2003, I was taken out of this University of Illinois where I was a junior and deployed to Kuwait and Iraq. And I still, remember my first mission into Iraq in May of 2003 after President Bush, declared mission accomplished. I was very motivated at the time. I thought we were going to go help provide humanitarian relief, help rebuild a country after getting rid of a terrible dictator. And I still remember that first mission, stopping at Camp Navistar on the Kuwait-Iraq border and getting my orders that we'd be traveling down MSR Tampa, that the threat level was red, that we need to watch out for suspicious objects in the roadway and not to stop. And we mounted up and headed out. And as soon as I crossed the border, there were families, kids, not bigger than my 2-year-old daughter is, willing to jump on a semi truck to get food or water. And at that time, I thought, these are the kids I'm here to help. But they were still there 6 months later, and 9 months later, and 12 months, and 13, and 14, and 15. And over the course of my deployment, it became very clear that we weren't there to help anyone, that we were there to help establish a military occupation and to reinforce the military infrastructure in Iraq, which incidentally resulted in hauling a lot of supplies for contractors that were making a lot of money at the time. I thought this idea of making money off of this whole endeavor very sickening. I thought the idea that we weren't there to help and instead that I was involved with pointing my weapon at families and communities was disgusting. And all my beliefs crumbled. Everything that I had thought I understood about myself, my understanding of the world, collapsed. And in this kind of existential crisis, the one thing that I thought I could still hang on to was art. Because I knew art was creative and not destructive. And to this day, I believe art is one of the only things that can transform destruction and create beautiful things. Most recently, I've spent a lot of time looking at the powerful work of artists that have survived Guantanamo and artists that are still in Guantanamo, and seeing the beautiful flowers and seascapes that they create despite all of the violence that they have experienced is inspiring and gives me hope. Hope that it all can be transformed. This belief in art and creativity and resistance led me to Iraq Veterans Against the War. I got very active with the organization in 2006 and helped a number of war resistors refuse to deploy or refuse to redeploy. We supported people that were headed to Canada. Instead of deploying, we supported people that were going to jail instead of deploying. Many of the thousands of service members have gone AWOL during the global war on terror, and many of them have spoken out against what they've seen in it. In 2008, I helped organize the Winter Soldier investigation. It was an attempt to bring the truth of what was happening in Iraq and Afghanistan to the American people who didn't know what was happening. That testimonies of veterans and survivors was heard and broadcast through Democracy Now!, but also censored in many ways and not picked up in local and international or national media in the United States. We kept organizing to bring the truth of the wars out and make it clear that we weren't fighting terrorism, we were fighting people in their homes, communities. This led to the 2012 Nato Summit that was in Chicago, in which a number of Afghanistan veterans walking side by side with Afghans for Peace and over 50 other, around 50 other veterans brought our service medals back to the NATO generals, because we knew that the Global War on Terror Service Medal that we had all received was based on lies. And we asked the generals at the summit to ceremoniously accept our medals back, and they refused. And so instead we marched with over 10,000 people, including led by Afghans for Peace, as I mentioned, and threw our medals back. Each of these moments was a moment to cathartically reject the global war on terror and speak truth to what was happening. In 2009, I was honored to be invited to Iraq to meet with different labor organizers in Iraq that were talking about how to end the occupation and bring about worker rights in Iraq. And despite our liberating the country, quote unquote, we carried over Saddam's labor laws and many other draconian laws affecting the rights of workers to organize. And at that conference, I heard about all the powerful nonviolent struggles that continuously, to this day, all the way up to the last number of years of nonviolent resistance in Iraq, that have been suppressed and not promoted and heard very much in the US media. In 2015, I was honored enough to go to Afghanistan to work with the Afghan peace volunteers. And Afghanistan has been on my mind a lot and recently, and I know it's been on the mind of many other veterans. And to this day, those friends that I met and befriended in Afghanistan who fought against the US occupation nonviolently, they built nonviolent campaigns for human rights there. And they currently fear their high profile campaigns for human rights, peace, and justice make them targets of the Taliban. And despite that, despite them knowing the potentiality of all this future that has now come to be, when I was there in 2015, I remember simply being asked by a very young gentleman do the Americans really believe that they're fighting terrorism? He asked because he thought that if they really believed it, that perhaps, that they could be forgiven, or it's something that can be forgiven. But if they know that they're not fighting terrorism, how could it be continued? And whether it's the Afghan war logs and the Iraq war logs, or it's the Afghan reports, we've known for years that we have not been fighting terrorism. And I think the earlier speaker spoke very well to how different forms of white supremacy that has grown and almost been enabled through the global war on terror. With that knowledge, what does it mean to perpetuate this war? And that is why it's important that we stop the global war on terror, and that we take responsibility and begin demanding justice. I just want to conclude by just noting that, I teach at a prison in Illinois, and a number of the individuals I work with are they're veterans. Some of them are veterans, but long before the global war on terror began, people had been talking about and being critical of the carceral state. And it's become very abundantly clear that all the technologies that were involved in perpetuating, building the carceral state and a militarized state are now being perpetuated and exported around the world through the global war on terror. And so what is important, I guess, for me to express is just that, my hope for ending these forms of dehumanization and prioritizing individuals' human rights.
Thank you so much, Aaron, for that really powerful testimony. It's so important to hear voices like yours, because, ultimately, as Cage has been doing, for most of our working life, when we bring these conversations together, it's always interesting what comes out of it. And, I remember still one of the most powerful events that we've done was bringing former guards at Guantanamo together with former detainees, and just hearing them speak to one another. It's very, very moving. I remember one incident when a former guard, Christopher, he came to the UK, and we organized this dinner with former detainees, and he entered into the restaurant, and he sees this detainee sitting there already right in front of him, and they're looking at one another, and there's complete silence. And the detainee, Tariq, he says, "I remember you." And he says, "I remember you too." And it turned out that Tariq had tried to snap off Chris's arm one day while he was trying to hand him a toilet roll. And, it had all the potential for going south very quickly, this moment. But what happened instead is that the two sat next to one another and recounted their time together in Guantanamo as if they were friends the whole time, and that they were sharing kind of buddy stories while they were there. And so I think, what comes down to these conversations can sometimes be so much more than simply the sharing of testimony. So thank you for being with us today. I do appreciate it a lot. And we're running a little bit behind schedule, and so I really want to bring in the final speaker of the day before we open up for a Q&A, which is my colleague, Mazen Beg. He's the outreach director of the organization, a former Guantanamo Bay detainee. He, of course, has a wonderful book about historical enemy combatant. And there is a really brilliant documentary on some of his experiences being incarcerated in the US unlawfully, and then in the UK unlawfully, called The Confession. So please do try and check that out. Mazen, the floor is yours.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum. Can you hear me fine? Can you hear me okay? Awesome.
Yeah, we can hear you. That's fine. Yeah.
Okay. So first of all, let me begin by saying that I've just been listening to everybody, and I have to say my heart was in my throat, listening to Amina Janjua, who I know well, who I've visited, whose story I know, listening to Lina Al-Aryan, and listening indeed to Aaron. And there's something that links all of this together for me, and it's very important that we think about this. Lawrence Wilkerson, who was the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff under Colin Powell, and remember under Colin Powell, it was the basis of evidence that he presented to the UN Security Council in 2003, evidence from the torture of Ibn Sheikh al-Libi that became the justification to invade Iraq. So Wilkerson, who was under him as the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, is one of the people who gave that evidence. And of course, he says that it was the most embarrassing thing that he'd ever done and the biggest mistake of his life, because the invasion of Iraq was based upon that false tortured evidence. But of course, the invasion was going to happen regardless. And it was going to happen regardless because there was a narrative that had existed already. And that narrative, today I just read that Wilkerson actually says that he believes that Israel, the state of Israel, has been the one thing that has undone the United States, its laws, its foreign policies, and so forth in connection to the Muslim world. And he says that if it continues in this way, the country will cause the downfall of the United States of America. Now, why is that important? It's important because Sister Elena Arian, of course, her and her family, the Holy Land 5 case and so forth, all of this is connected to a pre-9/11 story. And the story that Israel, Zionists and so forth present well before, and Wilkerson testifies to this and says that it was Israel that was pushing this narrative of Muslims in particular being terrorists, being extremists. And if you look at, in fact, every resistance movement in Israel, whether it's people who believed in Marxist socialism, like the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, whether it's Hamas, who believe in an Islamist, quote unquote, ideology, whether it's Fatah, who believed in the two-state solution, whoever they are, as long as they were opposed to the state of Israel, they were designated not just by Israel as a terrorist entity, they were designated as terrorists by the European Union and, most importantly, the United States of America. And this was all pre-9/11. So when you come to the point at which you are at 9/11 and what follows, and that you are either with us or you're with the terrorists, meaning that there's no space in between, there's no space for a Switzerland in this, there's no space for a Sweden in this, you're either with us or against us, then you can see what happens in the story of Sister Amina Masood Janjua. And Pakistan is a country that's, that some of us come from, have seen and lived and so forth, and may not be the best when it comes to human rights and dignity and so forth, but it was never known as a place for mass disappearance. And that only happens when the US-led war on terror begins and is perpetuated and is, as you can see, of course, myself, I was handed over by the Pakistani government to the US CIA without any legal process, despite the fact that my family also pushed into the courts habeas writs. The law didn't mean anything, just as the law in Guantanamo has meant nothing. 8 Supreme Court rulings in the favor of the prisoners at different junctures, which actually give them a win in the US Supreme Court, doesn't mean that they get taken to court and are released as a result of these rulings at the highest court of the land. The same in Pakistan. If America's doing this on its own soil, then imagine what's happening on the soil of countries that are less developed and are more frightened. Like Sister Amina said, that it was said to them that if you don't cooperate with us, we'll bomb you back into the Stone Age. And they were so beholden in Pakistan to the United States of America that Pakistan was the biggest culprit. It grabbed off the streets of its own country the largest number of people for bounty money and was sent over to the United States of America, to Guantanamo or to US custody. They went through a series of secret detention sites, the salt pit, the dark prison, the Bagram, Kandahar, and then ultimately Guantanamo. And those were the lucky ones, because we also know that the program that followed after that under the great liberator Obama was the drone program, where people were being killed instead of going through all the rigmarole of taking people into custody and holding them, costing tens of thousands of pounds or dollars, and putting them in Guantanamo and being called human rights abuses. Why not simply send the drone into in the sky, kill them, and who's gonna ask anymore? And you see, now the problem with this is that what you've got is it's a state of lawlessness created by the United States of America, with the detention programs, with the secret detention sites, and with the killing and the invasion. You can see the numbers of people killed as a result of September the 11th pales. I mean, if you look, just now we came to the 20th anniversary, 2,977 people were killed. We know that number. America exacted its revenge, and I call it revenge because this was not a police operation. This was not an operation of law enforcement. They still haven't, after 20 years, managed to convict anyone for a role, a significant role in September the 11th, after 20 years. So what they did was exact vengeance upon the Muslim world. The most conservative figures say 900,000 people were killed. We believe that it's triple that, but just say 900,000. That means they exacted the equivalent of 500 9/11s on Iraq and Afghanistan. That does not include those maimed. That does not include those made refugees in their own homes or elsewhere. That does not include those gone through the rendition programs and the torture and so forth. And see what you've got then as a result of all of this. Remember, America and Britain, its little brother in all of this, and indeed the rest of the world, they're all involved. It goes from Morocco to Thailand and everything in between. All of these countries involved in the torture program. In the torture of Abu Zubaydah, you've got countries like Poland and Lithuania and Romania actually involved in his torture and forced by the European courts to compensate him for their alien torture, yet he remains in Guantanamo as quote unquote a forever prisoner. So what this tells you is that America and the countries that connected to it, its coalition, jettisoned their entire belief system in A, holding any sort of moral high ground, and B, most importantly, anything that they could ever have argued that they believe in the rule of law. As a result of this, and these war crimes, because they must be described as war crimes that the United States has been involved in, not a single person has been held to account. There is no accountability. And if you just look at the most signature description of what took place when the Americans leave Afghanistan, defeated in Afghanistan, just like the Soviet Union, the last act of the United States of America in Afghanistan is to fire a drone missile in which they killed 12 members of one family, 7 of whom are children, 5 of whom are under the age of 4 years old. What does that tell you? What does it tell you about how this war has been conducted, this war of dehumanization? And if anything, all those people affected by this, from whether it's Sister Amina trying to, as a result of the United States foreign policy in her own country, trying to locate her husband for 16 years unsuccessfully, or whether it's those 2 children that were killed just in Afghanistan as the United States did. This is all part of that legacy. And this isn't to put all the blame on the United States of America. There's lots of other things, lots of people that were in cahoots. And that's part of the point, is that any idea of being a world-renowned country that people could look towards and say, yes, that's a country we should be like. America's lost that. That's the biggest thing it's lost after this war on terrorism. Now, I had the pleasure of meeting Aaron a few years ago. He came to the Cage office, and he hasn't told anybody this here in this juncture, but he began something called the Tea Project. And it's something quite fascinating. They created a teacup in the name of each of the former Guantanamo prisons. Now, this is important because you said, Asim, that Cage met with so many of these former Guantanamo prisoners, soldiers, and they came and they toured together with us. And we spoke about Guantanamo in ways that people would not have expected, and opened a door. And really, if you think about it, the way wars are seen, governments should have been receptive to this and say, look, here's a different way. People are talking, people who are opposed to one another, people who should, by and large, hate one another. Yet they are showing us a different way of dialogue, of discussion, of seeking justice. And You would have thought that, but none of them have. In fact, none of the governments want to hear this story. It's one that is one of our own making, ourselves, the former prisoners, the organizations, the lawyers, the campaigners, the families, and the former prisoners and the former soldiers. We did it of our own accord because we want to show a sense of humanity that perhaps people don't really understand could have developed in a place like this. So my 2 points to finish on, really. One is that, just for context, recently the International Criminal Court, to which we ourselves from Cage, former survivors, gave evidence to for the role of the United States in the torture and the abuse, including murder of prisoners that we witnessed, the ICC cancelled any attempt to prosecute the United States, because the United States response to that was that they issued sanctions against the head prosecutors of the ICC and said that if any ICC members come to the US, we will arrest them and have them thrown into prison. That was the response of the United States of America. So the ICC now say, oh, we've dropped that and we are going to work on the Taliban instead. So that shows you where the powers of justice and how they operate exist. There is no process. The ICC, whether it's any other tribunals that have been attempted, have all failed. So America is above the law when it comes to the war on terrorism. The second part I want to say is that from ourselves, the former Guantanamo prisoners, we developed a plan. We are still calling for the closure of Guantanamo. There are still 39 prisoners there that have been held without charge or trial for the most part. And we ourselves developed a program in a letter to Joe Biden, an open letter, in which we called for him to close Guantanamo, and this was the roadmap. So please do share this roadmap. Please do look at it and send it around. It needs to be implemented. It's one developed by ourselves, former prisoners, some of whom you may have heard of. And what it does is, in very easy but simple and direct terms, tell the President of the United States of America from our own voices of how this can be done. But if anything, I believe that the war on terror is not over. There must be accountability, and there are scenes of the crime like Bagram and others that still have to be fully investigated. Thank you. Jazakallah khair. Salam alaikum.
Jazakallah khair, Brother Mazem, and of course to all of our speakers today. I think it's been a really valuable gathering. We've heard from a number of different perspectives. The complexity that I highlighted at the beginning in the introduction, I think some of that really came through. Of course, you know, the war on terror is a bit like a malignant virus. You know, its tendrils go throughout the whole world. We could have spoken for the whole evening just about Iraq or Afghanistan or China or any specific country, because there is so much to talk about. There is so much to catalog, and we can't really do any of it justice in these, even in a 3-hour-long conference. But inshallah, we will continue to do our best to bring more events to you, more expert speakers, more survivors, so that we can learn, but also we can show solidarity to one another and hopefully build communities that can really push back against this war on terror. And of course, you're welcome to visit the Cage website, www.cage.ngo, and participate in any of our activities. And of course, the International Witness Conference and all of our partner organizations who are doing wonderful work. So now I'd like to ask all of the panelists to please put on their video and join us in this section for the Q&A. I'm going to open the Q&A function. Can I ask anybody who's got a question to please use the Q&A chat function. It's going to be the best way for us to actually field questions. And I'll pick questions from there, inshallah, and put them to all the various speakers. So thank you for that. I'm going to start with this one, directed at Spencer. TS is interested in how the so-called global war on terror affected the US relationship with Israel and other allies in the SWANA region before and after 9/11. So if you could please take that question. Do we have Spencer still? Maybe not. Maybe he vanished.
I think he's disconnected. Yeah, I think he's off.
Okay, no worries. Would anybody else like to have a crack at that question? Maybe Daryl?
Well, what's interesting is that I feel like the situation in Palestine and the relationship between the US and Israel is actually one of those areas where there's a lot more continuity than change, at least when we're talking about 9/11 and the war on terror. I mean, the relationship has changed in many ways, but there's like a stubborn, I think the situation there has its own sort of logic and its own rhythms, right? I mean, the Zionist settler project, of course, just like what I was saying about the US, it was there on September 10th, it was there on September 12th, it's still there today. Obviously, it's important to pay attention to the pioneering, pun intended, role that the State of Israel has often played in discourses around terrorism, technologies around terrorism, and Muslim alluded to some of this. And I actually am doing a little bit of research now about how a lot of the early terrorism laws in the United States were very much motivated by concerns around Israel. And the first list of terrorist organizations there's many different terrorism lists that the U.S. government has, but many of them, if you look at the first instantiations, they're basically about enemies of Israel, and the U.S. sort of, taking on Israel's enemies as its own. I think it's also important to recognize the complexity of the relationship too. I think, the quote that from Lawrence Wilkerson is really interesting, because I think it's absolutely true that Israel has had an impact on U.S. policy in a negative way. But when I hear those comments from senior U.S. officials, there's also a little bit of a feeling that they're trying to let themselves off the hook, right? Like if it wasn't for Israel, somehow the United States would be a little bit more benign. And I think that's, I don't think that you meant Muslim, but I think that is sometimes a reading that people adopt inside the U.S. as a way to kind of make a critique of Israel, but also not get painted as unpatriotic. And I don't think that analysis is on board. So I think what is important about the U.S. case is that, Israel is very clear about who its enemies are and who it's against. And what the U.S. does is a little bit more tricky, where they want to make sure that when they declare someone to be an enemy, they're not saying just that this is our enemy. They're saying that essentially these are the enemies of all mankind, right? So when the U.S. is sort of trying to declare on behalf of other countries, what is a terrorist organization, what is an outlawed organization, they're able to do that because of their global sort of power and hegemony, which Israel does not have, right? Israel can be much more blatant about what its agenda is, who it's after, who it's fighting. The U.S. does that while at the same time trying to cloak in the idea that they're doing it on behalf of, the national community or the rest of the world or what have you.
Thank you, Daryl. I appreciate your thoughts on that, and I know that you've spent a lot of time in Palestine, so it's good to get your insights on Israel's relationship to the war on terror. Mazem, I've got a question from Rojo here about Afghanistan and how it's been kind of a victim of the war on terror, but at the same time, kind of obviously the Taliban have managed to push what seemed an invincible Western military power out of the country. He's wondering how we should view the Taliban, especially with relation to kind of stories of fearful women hiding in their homes post the American exit. So I was wondering if you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, first of all, it's famous that Mullah Omar reportedly said that you may have all the weapons that we have all the time. And of course, Afghanistan, in the end, if you present it, it depends on how you present it, right? You see, the operation to take out Osama bin Laden is called Operation Geronimo. When I was in Afghanistan, the first things to strike were Tomahawk cruise missiles. The idea of using that which belonged to enemies from before you, like Apache helicopters and Black Hawks and so forth, from the Native Americans. So it's this sense of America using those and internalizing those weapons and then saying that they are now ours, that we use them against the natives. Here in Afghanistan, they knew, Americans always knew from the time of the Soviet occupation, perhaps those who studied their history and even knew before with the British incursions during its empire in Afghanistan, is that this is a place that if you get bogged down in here, you will get stuck and you will not come out of here, no matter how hard you try, with victory. And that is why, for example, Mullah Abdul Salam Zaif, who was supposed to be here, actually told me on a visit that General Petraeus came to his house after he'd been released from Guantanamo, and Petraeus was the head of the US military there. And he said, Mr. Zaif, I need you to help me to find a way to talk to the Taliban, right? So Mullah Zaif said to him something that was so typical of what I expect his response to be. And he told me this, and he said that, you see, if you want to talk to the Taliban, it's so easy. All you have to do is that you see those rockets and tank shells that you fire and Tomahawk cruise missiles that you fire at them, follow the trajectory of these missiles, and where they land, you'll find the Taliban ready to talk or to fight. And so that was the whole point, that the Americans, this was back in like 2009, they wanted out of Afghanistan. They understood its history, that you cannot get stuck in here. There's a quagmire and people will fight here till the last. And in the end, it was that negotiation. It's crucial. It was the Guantanamo prisoners that were set up the first political office in Doha. And it was their release with Sergeant Bo Bergdahl on the other side, with whom the US military met. If you see the footage of what happened, there's all these Taliban fighters up in the mountains, a helicopter lands, and the Taliban bring Bo Bergdahl, and then they hand him over. And then just before they leave, they shake hands. Now this is in 2014, so they're shaking hands with their enemy. And so what it shows, in my view, is that this could not have been possible with ISIS. It could not have been possible with Al-Qaeda either. But they knew it was possible with the Taliban. And so whether they liked it or not, look at the last point that happened. I mean, the withdrawal of the United States, which nobody talks about at all, is that there's a suicide bombing that takes place at Kabul airport. About 160 odd Afghans are killed. The front page news is that 13 US soldiers, 13 Marines are killed, right? Nobody mentions that there's 28 Taliban fighters killed. 28 Taliban fighters who are holding their position, knowing, because the Taliban gave the intelligence to the Americans, that ISIS is planning an attack. And they hold their position regardless, and they get killed. And here's the punchline: defending the Americans who are leaving, as well as these other people. So I think, like the head of the Joint Chiefs of here in the UK, Nick Carter, he said that the Taliban are, and I quote, like country boys with a code of honor, want an inclusive government, and we should stop referring to them as our enemies. That guy commanded 55,000 NATO troops in Afghanistan. So this is kind of like what you would call a begrudging respect for your foe. Now comes the point of, how do the Taliban rule women in Afghanistan and so forth? And that's a big story. One thing I will say is that the Taliban need to learn from the past. They need to follow through with what they have said. They've given amnesties to everybody, and they've said on their tongues and have put out in press releases that we urge, to quote, we urge women to come along and join us in our government. That's what they've said. They've got to prove it. They've got to show it. The other thing is that I have to say, the majority of Afghans don't live in Kabul, they don't live in Ghazni, they don't live in Jalalabad, they don't live in Herat, and they don't live in Mazar-e-Sharif. They live in the villages, and that's 70%. And we are not hearing the story of the Afghan women who live as the majority in those regions. The reason why is because the largest number of military operations that took place in places like Sangin and Helmand and Lashkargah and all the Pashtun areas around the south is where these operations took place. And what happened to the women in these areas, if you listen to what they have to say, there's a recent article in the New Yorker in which the life of one woman is told through all of these different junctures in Afghan history, where she says, and they say, that you bring education to the women of Kabul, but you bring death and destruction to the women in this region. You call that equality, you call that justice. So I think there has to be a contextual argument and a discussion about that. Yeah, pretty much.
Thank you, Martin. Fawzi's got a question, which I hope Lena can take, and maybe Aminabad, if she's still on the call. She said, immense kudos to all of you, hugely brave people, to continue struggle against these multifarious forms of blatant injustice. Where do you find the strength to keep going? It's really inspirational.
I don't know that I have the strength as much as I have the rage. I'm upset all the time because these policies continue to go completely unchecked. I derive whatever strength that I have from our families, you know, the families who are out there on the front lines living this day in and day out. None of us had a choice to be a part of this. We were targeted by, you know, no action of our own other than for caring about, you know, an unpopular political cause or advocating for it, or being the wrong skin color or faith. But I never know how to answer these questions, to be honest with you, but it comes from somewhere. I don't know, maybe, you know, I think I'm a spiritual person. I'm a believing person. So a lot of it comes from this sense of a divine purpose, that the reason why we were spared, you know, for better or worse, is to continue the fight for others, having gone through it ourselves, and to walk in step with the families that continue to, you know, to fight. And I would maybe throw this question to Brother Muslim to ask you, where do you find the strength as a survivor as well?
Listening to people like you, sister. When I listen to people like you, listening to people like Amin and Janju, I'm telling you, when I was listening to you guys, I had my heart in my throat, because there's a different, you know, people fighting for their relatives. And hearing about that destruction of the family. Nobody cares about that. Nobody wants to hear that part of the story. It's not even for those who are interested in the story, as it were, of the prisoners. Nobody really wants to hear about what happened to the family. And those of us who are family people will understand this. I think, well, that means all of us. We're all family people in one way or the other. Will understand that the real heroes are the ones who don't get hurt.
Thank you both. Aaron, TS has asked a question. What has helped you heal, if anything? What advice would you give to other veterans?
I appreciate the question. You know, to me, the most powerful, I guess, two most powerful things are getting active and speaking out, speaking truth. Often there's not a lot of positive outlets, and there's not a lot of space to speak truth about military experiences, and also have a critical kind of analysis of them. And so, especially within this country that's rooted so deeply in militarism, and yet speaking out can really be extremely helpful. But more powerful than that was my return trip to Iraq in 2009. And, you know, that's where the tea project originated. During my entire deployment, I refused to have tea. I was offered tea by Iraqis, by third country nationals, by Kuwaitis, and I refused. We were told it could be poisoned. It was seen as a threat. This offer of generosity and hospitality was a threat somehow. And at that conference, I acknowledged my role and apologized, and I talked about the resistance and anti-war movement in the United States. That was my role at the conference, of some 400 workers from around the world. And after I was done speaking, a man jumped up in the back of the auditorium and started yelling something in Arabic. And I thought, okay, you know, this guy's going to come beat me up. And he just booked onto this stage. And as he came on the stage, I heard the translation come through. And I thought this was it, but I was at, I was there to be in solidarity. So what happened would happen. And instead of punching me, he grabbed me and hugged me. And I just broke down and cried. And I guess the guest from the US crying in front of some 400 workers wasn't the conference organizers' idea of a good time. So they brought me out of the auditorium, sat me down, and they made me tea. And that was the first time that I had Iraqi tea. And it made me think about all the acts of generosity, despite that I had been offered, that I had refused, and that story of generosity had never reached the US. Generosity of the Iraqi people, of the Afghan people. And I appreciate Moslem's comments. I just want to note, and I also know around the Taliban, I also know for my friends that are there that they have been concerned, and that just whatever means you use determines the end. Using coercion, torture, and policies predict the outcome of what will happen. And my heart is with all the Afghan people that hopefully can build a society in which everyone has a voice and a space. And I hope that's the future. And I know the US, outside of a role of reparations, we don't really have a role in that future, and a role of solidarity, but we don't have other kinds of roles in that.
Thanks so much, Aaron. Really appreciate your words. Daryl, there's a question here that was aimed at Spencer, but actually I think because we can't get in touch with him right now, I think you'd be ideal to take it. So I'm not sure Spencer was saying this himself, but the Mo's asking whether or not it's fair to make the comparison between white people and Muslims, since kind of white is more of a race, whereas Islam is more of an ideology. And I think, I don't 100% get the question in reference to what Spencer was saying, but I think maybe we do hear kind of this narrative about kind of Islamism being the kind of flip side of kind of white supremacy and whatever. So I thought maybe you might have some thoughts on that, if that's what the question was.
Yeah, that's a whole bucket of fried chicken issue right there. I think that what this idea that is kind of going around of so-called racialization of Muslims, I think what it is trying to capture is that in sort of ruling ideologies in places like the United States, there's an idea of Muslims that is really a racial idea. And of course, yes, Islam is not a race, right? So it's already kind of a ridiculous idea, but we also have to remember that race is always a kind of social construct, right? Albeit one that is very much rooted in, or connected, I should say, to biological processes, but also very much, when we say it's a construct, that doesn't mean you can just decide one day not to believe in it and it just goes away. It just means that it's not like directly something you can read off of DNA. So the idea of racialization of Muslims in a place like the United States is this idea that a Muslim can be perceived and can be known, can be recognized through racial characteristics, right? They're kind of vaguely brown. Now, again, that doesn't account for the fact that there are many Muslims who are Black, there are Muslims who are white, there are Muslims who are Asian. But I think if there is that kind of idea that exists and it has material impact, right? If you look at, Sikhs or other non-Muslims who are racialized as Muslim, who experience that violence, right? In that moment, whether they are or whether they identify as Muslims or not is beside the point, right? It's that they are being considered as such and targeted as such. And that's where that racialization idea comes into play. But yes, it's very messy because it collides with the fact that Muslims, that there is racialization and also racism amongst Muslims, right? So Muslims are not a racial category in the lived, reality of Islam, the Ummah, or whatever. So I think it's important to be careful about when we deploy these terms. I think as a way to understand what the US is doing, this idea of racialization is certainly relevant because the US is a racial regime, but it certainly is not, the main way that I would understand the lived experiences of Muslims, all around the world.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. I think that's well put. And one of the things I always mention to people when I'm talking about this subject is, we had a man here in the UK, a Brazilian man who was shot 12 times in the back of his head by the British police. They thought he was a man named Hamza. They had some false intelligence. They didn't know who he was. They looked at his brown skin, made all sorts of assumptions about him, chased him, even though he didn't know he was being chased, down into the London Tube and shot him in the back of his head. And what I always say to people is that it's important to remember that the police thought they were killing a Muslim, right? It doesn't matter in the end what Jean-Charles de Menezes' kind of religion, faith, nationality was. All that really matters in that moment, in terms of how we understand it from perspective of Islamophobia, is how the police perceived him to be, and they perceived him to be a Muslim. So I think that's kind of fits into what you're saying about the markers of Islamophobia and how they racialize us into a pathology of ultimately Muslimness. There's some very general questions here, which I think I want to take up by the end, and maybe I'll ask all of you to just give some comments on them before we close. How about this one? When people are talking about the war on terror, most of them are talking about the USA, UK, and other Western aggressors. But what about countries like China and Russia? They created not less anti-Muslim and human rights crimes in the USA. How could we change the narrative not to raise the victims of Russia and China? Mazem, I do want you to take this on, but Amna Baji, I think it's important that we also talk about this in the context of Pakistan, which is, in your experience, which is clearly carrying out a war on terror against its own population, right? So it's kind of that domestic situation that we don't, like we know of Islamophobia in the USA, we see that's the war on terror. We see UK policies against British Muslims as the war on terror. But in the case of a country like Pakistan, it's this, technically your co-religionists, your it's the same ethnicity who are targeting you in that way. So Mazem, if you could go first, please, answering the question directly, and then Amna Baji, I'll come to you, inshallah. You're on mute, Mazem. I know the government is trying to mute you, but don't mute yourself.
Just following on about the question earlier on, and just trying to connect it really. Remember Brendan Tarrant, who did the killings in the Christchurch mosques? When he did the killings, when he was doing them, he was live streaming and he was listening to songs that praised Radovan Karadzic, who was the head of the Bosnian Serbs, and under whom, of course, we know that the genocide of Muslims took place in Europe. This genocide was of white, blonde-haired, blue-eyed, Slavic Muslims. But even they got racialized. Even they, in his eyes, because he's somebody from the far right. How is somebody from the far right celebrating the death of white people? Doesn't make sense, does it? Unless they're Muslims. Even more so, and connecting this now, is that he, in a manifesto, had written, I believe, praise for the Communist Party, the Chinese Communist Party, the Chinese Communist government, for its treatment of the people of the Uyghurs of East Turkestan. How does he do that? How does somebody from the far right praise a communist country? How does he do that? And the answer, of course, is his perception of Muslims. And so there you can see, when you connect it to that, Xi Jinping, the head of China, has said that we must use, to paraphrase, George Bush's language of the war on terrorism in order for us to quell the Uyghurs of East Turkestan. And of course, if you look at that, and I was speaking to some Uyghurs recently who said that there are people dressed in orange jumpsuits in East Turkestan, in the prisons there. And I said, who are they? She said, the political prisoners. I said, how does one become a political prisoner in East Turkestan? And she said, by replying, wa alaikum assalam to assalamu alaikum. That's an act. That's a political act. Wearing a hijab is a political act. Fasting in Ramadan is a political act. Abstaining from haram is a political act. All of those are seen as acts of political acts, not like how we would say, at least here in the UK and elsewhere, they're actually to do with some kind of political position, as opposed to a real normative action of Islam. So you can see here now the extension to the law, the war on terrorism, its language. America's diametrically opposed nation, China, its enemy, has adopted its language, and everything in between, like Modi and the Hindu nationalists of India, or whether it's in Russia against the Chechens and the other republics, or whether it's indeed Nobel Peace Prize winning Aung San Suu Kyi, who calls the Rohingya in her country terrorists. The language is completely now taken up by every despot. To use the term terrorist and extremist to describe Muslims is normal throughout the world. And that is something that, again, is one of the legacies of the war on terror.
Thank you. Amnabachi.
Yeah, thank you, Asim, and thank you, Mozam, for your kind compliments. Yeah, Pakistan is one such country where there is a war on terror kind of thing going on. And we have been campaigning not just against war on terror, but also against all those human rights violations which are occurring as a result of the war on terror, NATO forces. And he's quite right in saying that we do mention atrocities done by the Americans and atrocities done by the NATO forces, the West, but we kindly ignore the role of Russia and China in human rights violations. And this is very much true. Because when I was traveling and I was visiting Philippines, then in one of my streets, I happened to see some Chinese people, and they were Uyghurs, and they were holding a protest. And their protest was just silent. They were sitting there and they were not doing anything, and they had some pamphlets. And that was a kind of a strange protest which I saw, because they were simply sitting and they were not saying a single word. There was another person which was handing over the pamphlets. After that, I logged on to their website and everything, and I got to understand what was happening in China. And then I also saw many people coming through Xinjiang border, which Pakistan and China are next door neighbors. A lot of Uyghurs are coming here as well. And they talk about the discrimination and the human rights violations which are happening. Actually, China and Russia are two such communist countries in which everything is very much under the carpet. There's no media, no free media. There's only their own state-owned media, which is giving a very controlled information to outside world and also to their own citizens. So this is one of the reasons we don't hear about human rights violations which are occurring over there. So it's very unfortunate, but we keep on arranging such campaigns in which we talk about Uyghurs and their problems, also on webinars, because this is one such medium. Webinars are very important, especially to connect with all the world and all the kinds of voices and dialogues in which we can engage and we can understand even the problems which are happening in China and Russia through the webinars, because we don't have to actually go there, but we get connected with the people who understand and who know what's happening inside. So that's about it. And I'm afraid Pakistan is not one such country which raises voice for its own people. So it's obviously it will not raise voice for the Uyghurs or for anyone. But Imran Khan, our prime minister, never raised voice for Uyghurs. So that's very unfortunate. Although we always say that China is our next door neighbor, China is our best friend, and there's a CPAC going on in across Pakistan, in which the Chinese are going to have access to warm waters in less than 1/6 of their actual route. So that's all the benefit goes to China. But in return, Pakistan could have asked about conditions to improve for the Uyghurs, conditions of the freedom for religion, freedom for religious ceremonies. Like Ramadan is so important for Muslims, and they are not allowed to fast. This is so ridiculous. And so, I mean, our heart goes out for them, that for them, like to be not able to fast is something so important, and not express anything on the ceremonies like Eid and Eid al-Azha. Of course, they won't be able to sacrifice animals at all. So unfortunately, this is it. And in Afghanistan as well, after Taliban have come, I hope that they have good relations with China. They should also, I think they should stress this point and get the Uyghurs their human rights back. Thank you.
Thank you, Amina Baji. I don't know, I think Lena might have left us. I was going to ask her. Oh, there we go. Lena, I want to ask you, it was a question that was more generally about the war on terror being overshadowed by the coronavirus pandemic, but I guess I want to take Sophia's question and make it a bit more specific to your work with the Coalition for Civil Freedoms, because of course you guys, you support prisoners, political prisoners, you support their families in so many different ways. And I guess I want to know a little bit about how that has impacted kind of prisoners in America, because of course the pandemic's crazy over there in many places.
Yeah, thank you for the question. Of course, it's terrible. The situation on the inside is horrible. It's the guards, of course, who bring it in. The prisoners have no access to the outside world. They're sitting ducks. There was one prisoner who was a victim of rendition, had nothing to do with the United States. He's a Somali Swedish man who was down in Somalia with other people. And, there was a civil war, and he was caught in the country of Djibouti, tortured and brought to the United States. His attorney was quoted on Democracy Now! Saying, his name is Muhammad Yusuf, saying that the first exposure his client ever had to this country was when he was brought here in chains. So he was in a prison in Lompoc, California, and the I can't remember exactly what the Bureau of Prisons had said, but they tried to absolve themselves of any responsibility. And then, as you may imagine, there are a lot of prisoners who have technology, cell phones inside. We received an email from them saying that he had been suffering for days, a slow, painful death. He couldn't breathe, and that he died in front of them. And this prisoner said that he continued to suffer from really horrible nightmares every night, just recalling what he had seen. And I thought, the words "I can't breathe," and it happened right around the time of George Floyd's murder, which was also the last words that he said. Muhammad Yusuf was on the phone with his mother, and that those were also one of the final words that we were told, reported. At the same time, there have been opportunities that we received to be able to get some prisoners out. Our legal team was able to get 3 prisoners released on compassionate release grounds because of the coronavirus, who have vulnerabilities to it. So these are prisoners. 2 of them had over 10 years left on their sentences. These are all material support cases, terrorist convictions. In one case, there was a man who was targeted and entrapped by the FBI in Chicago to the point where they had cameras in his bedroom. The informant who was working on him pretended to be his girlfriend. I mean, it's a horrible case. But just to tell you that in his order to release him, his name is Sami Hassoun, you should read about his case. The judge said that had it not been for the FBI, he probably wouldn't have done it. And that was such a huge admission for a judge to acknowledge, that had it not been for the government prodding him, that he would likely not have, even gone through with any plot. So, we're still working on getting some people out. There's a woman with, she's in prison for literally retweeting ISIS. This is the level of cases that, the government thinks are big, bad terrorists on the loose. A lot of it free speech types of cases. So please support our work, because we do this completely free of charge for these prisoners.
Absolutely. Jazakallah khair. Yeah, I mean, Coalition for Civil Freedoms is definitely one of the most important organizations in the US. So for those of you who have the means, please do donate what you can to their work. Aaron, there was an interesting question that I wanted to send your way, which is how can we help other veterans come to your position in relation to the role that they've played? I think, you know, that's an important question to ask, because I guess there's a role for those of us outside of kind of military structures to also to play in these things.
Well, unfortunately, there's not a lot of social political space for veterans or anyone being critical of militarism in our society. And you know, I just have to, you know, I can't help but think about January 6th and this takeover of the US Capitol, and there was a number of reports about the number of veterans involved in that. And I assess that as veterans have a lot of critical questions about what our government's doing, and there's not a lot of space in progressive or justice or human rights focused avenues for them to speak and bring truth to their experiences. Whereas reactionary and white supremacist spaces have, you know, created and almost done a lot of outreach. And I think that is it creates a very dangerous situation. And I think the most important work that I'm committed to doing, and many other veterans are committed to doing, is creating that space for critical dialogue and for veterans to engage and build solidarity. And, you know, it's as often so, most veterans, many veterans are not white male combat veterans, and yet that is the overwhelming dominant narrative. And there is so much diversity within the US military, and yet those stories are marginalized. And creating space for the diversity of the veteran experience to be put forth, for the criticality of the racism, sexism, homophobia, misogyny within the military to come out, you know, all of these things would garner, I think, a more space for veterans to see how they're often the places that they're coming from. You know, my good friend here in Chicago, who talks a lot about how, you know, the work she was doing deploying MRAPs into Afghanistan, those MRAPs then are back here in the States, impacting her own community. And so seeing those connections of many individuals from marginalized communities having solidarity, that many of you all have spoken to this idea of solidarity. I think that's really key, creating spaces and moments for solidarity. And sorry to go on, but I don't deserve any of the generosity or hospitality that has been offered to me again and again. And yet that has continuously created more space for me to speak out. And I don't know how to thank individuals like Mosem and many people on this call, and, you know, in general, that have shared that generosity despite, to really create this space for people to speak out, that are coming from, you know, really at times spaces full of hate.
Thank you for that. Appreciate your words. I think we've got time for one or two last questions before we have to close. Daryl, here's an interesting one. The West markets the war on terrorism means to spread democracy and freedom, but it's quite evident that the definition of democracy is not the same everywhere, considering countries like Saudi Arabia is one of their closest allies, especially within the war on terror. If you could give your opinion. Oh, you're
yeah, I mean, I don't know what to add. I think the question states very important truth. The United States is often hypocritical in its stances, and that's not used. And it's important to, you know, always be attuned to that. So I don't really have anything, profound to say other than to, yes, affirm that the question states something that I agree with.
Thanks. I mean, yeah, I agree completely with what you're saying. I think it is unfortunately a self-evident truth that the Americans really don't care about actual democracy. Okay, I mean, this is pretty much the end of the event. And so what I want to end with is maybe just kind of a 30-second to 1 minute closing remark from each of you. I think it'd be great to hear from our speakers, your final thoughts, and then hopefully I can close out. So just my thanks to you all again for all your words so far. So perhaps if we start as my screen goes with Marzam, and then I'll let you know. You're on mute again, Marzam.
In 20 years of the war on terrorism, I'm reminded of the words of the famous the second Khalifa, Umar ibn al-Khattab, who said, "Hasibu anfusakum qabla an tuhasibu." Hold yourself to account before you are held to account. And this concept of accountability is what makes the difference between a nation that can be a source of good or for good for everybody else and not. If you can't hold yourself to account, let's remember, the most respected man on the planet up until he died was a convicted terrorist called Nelson Mandela. He went to prison for 27 years for belief and taking part in armed resistance against the apartheid regime of South Africa. He said it's a principle that he's prepared to live for and a principle that he was prepared to die for when he was sentenced. And yet we saw that through his own journey, his magnanimity and rising above, his answer wasn't vengeance. And this is the lesson that we need to learn, that here, South Africa, with all of its problems and all of its troubles and all of the racism that exists even to this day, the principles that came out from there about truth and reconciliation as a way forward is a good idea. It would be great to do something like this. But when you have a government or governments that are so arrogant, that have such hubris, that will say they'll do exercises in openness and then can we just move on, please? It means they're not serious at all about holding themselves to account. And therefore, if they can't do that, we need to find places that can, people that can, individuals that can, organizations that can. And I hope that we can be from amongst those sorts of people when we remember this 20-year war on terror.
Aaron, please.
I'm just extremely grateful for this opportunity and inspired by Mozam's vision and what he shared earlier, this idea that people have been, he and these former guards showed a different way was possible. And unfortunately, the states have not taken this up, but I hope we can continue to build solidarity, internationally, and show and demonstrate over and over and over again until it becomes transformative to these to this war and to all of the dehumanization that underpins it. So thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. I'm really grateful to learn and hear from all of you.
Thank you. Daryl, please.
I just want to echo what's been said in terms of expressing gratitude and humility. Just thank you so much for bringing us together, Cage and the International Witness Campaign. Thank you to all the other panelists. I've learned so much listening to you. I don't have that much to add other than I think, we've talked a lot about solidarity, and I just want to repeat something I said earlier, which is that solidarity is also very difficult and it's very messy. And I think that's something not to shy away from. And part of what it means to take a stand is that you are planting your feet, in a specific place, right? And a lot of the really difficult questions and really important questions that have been in the chat box, I notice people often will say something like, oh, what about people who do X? In fact, I just did it myself. What should we do? And I think those, when we talk about people, right, we talk about we, those are not abstract categories, right? We're all in a specific place, operating under specific circumstances with certain resources and certain constraints. And I think a lot of the work of honest solidarity is about assessing those things and understanding that not everyone necessarily will have the same answer all the time, and that oftentimes joint struggle involves recognizing those differences, and that people are just going to act in different ways based on where they're coming from. And we may not always like that, of course, but it is just something that's impossible to avoid. And when we talk about solidarity, that's something we should recognize and not erase.
Lena, please.
Sorry, I was muted. I just wanted to thank Cage and the International Witness Campaign again for hosting us and allowing us to reflect on the 20th anniversary. And I really want to go back to what you were saying in the beginning, Austin, that, after 20 years, it's really time to start trying to, to look at this differently in terms of what can we do to bring these policies to an end. And anybody who was moved by anything that, I talked about today, we are trying to do several campaigns to end the policies of the war on terror, at least on the US front. So please do reach out to me, sign up for our listserv and get involved. And inshallah, we will be continuing the conversation with Cage. If you want to plug that, we have a report coming out, and we have a lot of plans for doing some community work with mosques in the coming months as well. So since you worked most on it, you can just plug that in, since it is happening fairly soon. Awesome.
Sure.
I mean, awesome. Sorry.
No worries.
I haven't finished
Thank
my
you.
cup of coffee today.
No worries. Thank you so much, Lena. Amna Baji.
Thank you so much, Asim. It was really inspirational, and everybody of us have really enjoyed it, and especially the Cage team, and it was a wonderful opportunity. And I would like to add this, that whoever is in trial, he or she should think about the life of the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, that how he was tried. And especially one incident which is very, very inspirational and giving hope and courage to us all is the occasion when he went to Taif, and when he invited people towards Islam, he was stoned, and the children were laughing and they were calling out names, and the feet of our beloved Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam were all covered with blood. So at that occasion, when he took refuge in a jungle of dates, and he was sitting there, and he could have given some badua for those who have done this to him. But instead of saying this, he said that, "Oh Allah, I'm here, and I'm sure that if they don't understand, their children will understand." So this is a really enlightening thing for us, that he could have, the angel Jibrail came to him and said, if you say all those two mountains of Taif, we can just collide the two mountains and all the people inside would die. But instead of killing all of them, all the people, all the humanity, he stood up for Rahmat. Rahmat means to forgive and to be peaceful and to give, allow people to live. So for that, later on, the children of the same people became very good Muslims. So in the same way, what Aaron was saying, that I do not deserve all this, you really deserve it, because that is how Muslims are. We are open-hearted, we are open-minded. Although people usually think that we are the narrow-minded ones, but we are actually really very, very broad-minded, and we are ready to embrace you with everything good or bad is attached with you, and anybody, because all humans have some good things as well as bad things. And what my father used to say, always when I was depressed and everything, this is one golden ayat of Quran Pak. It is Surah Baqarah, Inna Allaha ma'as sabirin, which means that for those who do patience, Allah is with them, God is with them. So God bless Asim and Mozam Bhai. It was really inspirational to be here.
Thank you so
Thank
much,
you.
Samana Baji. Jazakumullah khair. And it's left with me now to close up and to thank all of our panelists who have spent a great deal of their time with us. These are all extremely busy people who, as you've heard already, are involved in a lot of work to help other people. So the fact that they've taken their time out in order to help educate us, I think is a real blessing. I really feel very moved by all of the contributions tonight. Definitely kind of many vignettes for me to reflect on and think about. And I do want to thank, this entire campaign, especially for a start, Shazana in Cage, who, subhanAllah, this sister's kind of run this whole operation by herself, the whole campaign. It's easy to take orders when you have somebody like that in charge of an operation, because you just do what you're told to do, knowing that somebody's taking care of all the details along the way. So, please keep Shazan in your du'as, because she very much deserves it. But of course, all the partners, it's not easy to get 55 organizations. People like Daryl and Aaron and Lena know when you're organizing, when you're trying to do activism, one of the hardest things to do is to get people to say, yes, I'm willing to put my brand to your vision, because it takes a lot of work. And part of the work that Shazana was doing was to get, all of these organizations to say, yes, we can get behind this thing. This was very unique. I've been doing this work for 18 years now, and I've never seen a campaign have such a broad support base for it. And we're talking about here now in Charlotte, it's going to be months of activities. This isn't just the only event. We've got a whole series of things planned. And, as Lena was pointing out, this week we're going to have 2 days of conferences that all of you should be paying attention to. Wednesday and Thursday. The flyers will unfortunately go out on Monday because we've been up against it with so many activities going on. But we'll have panel discussions on various aspects of the war on terror, and that's all to launch a new report where we have 25 scholars coming together to write about different aspects of the war on terror in very unique ways. So that report's going to be very, very helpful in thinking about what's happened over these last 20 years, but also it has a brilliant set of recommendations about how we go forward in the future. In terms of the International Witness Campaign, we have our own recommendations that we've come together in order to promote, and I just want to read them out because I think they're important for us to think about as we leave this event. So our demands are, firstly, acknowledgement. We need acknowledgement of the crimes committed in the name of state-sponsored violence. We need accountability, that's the second one. Accountability for all governments, agencies, and individuals, but officials in particular who are guilty of crimes or misconduct since 2001. We also need restorative justice, which means that we need this justice for victims and survivors of state-sponsored violence. And finally, we do need the complete dismantlement of the infrastructure that makes these crimes possible, which means the law, which means the policies that have gone to build this architecture of the global war on terror. So, these are big demands, they're bold demands, but we feel like there can never be true justice and true transparency and accountability until these demands are met. And we should not aim low when it comes to these demands. We should always aim high. We should always be hopeful that our demands will be met at some point, because if we lower the bar for what justice looks like, then that is what states will jump on and will say, hey, fine, we'll give you this concession, we'll give you that concession. But all it will be sugarcoating over a system of injustice and oppression. So I hope that you will all take something away from today. I'm sorry, yeah, that we didn't get to all of the questions that were posed to us. It's just always very difficult when you have limited time. But I do thank you all for staying with us for the last 3 hours. It's been really, really wonderful. And I hope that we will all stay in touch with one another in the future. Thank you, everybody. All the best. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.